So after doing his PhD in Valencia, he's been postdoc in Max Planck Institute, I assume in Potsdam. And then after this one oscillation, he's returned to Valencia 2011, and he's been a Ramon y Cajal Fellow since 2017. So Pablo is in general interested in numerical simulations with general relativity and maybe other ingredients, and core collapse supernovae and neutron stars in general. So Pablo, please take it away.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So and thank you for the invitation to give this seminar today. So today I'm going to focus in trying to understand gravitational waves in the case of core collapse supernovae. So yeah. So here we are going to talk about the collapse of the core, of the iron core of massive stars. We are talking about masses between 8 and 100 solar masses, which at the end of the revolution, they have formed a heavy iron core in their innermost parts. And this iron core becomes, if it exists certain mass, the Chandrasekhar mass for the conditions given in the core, then it will collapse and as a result of this collapse, densities will increase at the center, and as these densities reach nuclear matter density, there is phase transition from nuclei to nucleons, mostly neutrons, so you form a proto-neutron star. Okay, so it's the innermost part of the collapsing core forms is transformed into neutrons essentially, and forms a proto-neutron star. So this makes that the equation state differs by this phase transition, and this produces a bounce of the collapsing core. So this bounce, what it ejects is a shock which propagates outwards. Now this shock is not doesn't result in a supernova explosion, never. This shock, what it happens is that it's trying to expand against the collapsing core. So the iron core is still collapsing, and this shock is trying to expand, but it cannot travel against the matter which is falling. So it gets stalled. So you end up into a situation in which you have a proto-neutron star, which is still very hot. That's why we just call it proto-neutron star. So it still has to cool down to form a neutron star. And then you have an accretion shock, which is stalled and is not propagating outwards yet. So now this inner region, the densities are such that you are producing neutrinos and antineutrinos, which are trying to escape. The proto-neutron stars so initially are trapped into a proto-neutron star, then they diffuse out, and once they reach the neutrinosphere at the surface of the proto-neutron star approximately, they stream out. And they stream out interacting with the fluid which is falling down from that has crossed the accretion shock and is accreting into the proto-neutron star. And they deposit some energy into this infalling matter. So if the budget, the energy budget that you have is about 10 to the 53 ergs that will be emitted in neutrinos, and if just 1% of this energy is deposited behind the shock, then what you have is a supernova explosion. So the standard model for core collapse supernova explosions is the neutrino-driven mechanism, in which is a small fraction of the the available neutrino energy, which is deposited behind the shock, and this produces an explosion which ejects essentially all the matter of the star, except for the innermost part, which remains and which will produce the neutron star. And this is the main mechanism to produce neutron stars. Okay, so this mechanism is valid for non-rotating or slowly rotating progenitor, and these form probably more than 99% of all progenitors. So this is the most common mechanism producing core-collapse supernova explosions. So in some cases, if you have very fast rotation, you may have magnetorotational explosions in which magnetic fields and rotation also play a role. But the regular case, and the one that I'm going to focus on this talk, is the neutrino-driven explosion. There is also a variant of this case, which is the case in which neutrinos are not able to deposit sufficient energy to produce an explosion. In this case, if there is no explosion, so matter keeps accreting until the neutron star reaches the maximum mass and it collapses to a black hole. But these two cases, the neutrino-driven explosion or the case in which you have a black hole formation, are very similar from the point of view of gravitational waves. So we are going to treat them essentially in the same way for the rest of the talk. So it doesn't matter really, or there is not a big difference if at the end you form a black hole or you have a supernova explosion. In both cases, you are going to have very similar features in the gravitational waves. So these events should be observable in gravitational waves within 10 kiloparsecs or so for neutrino-driven explosions. So if they are magnetorotational explosions, they may be visible farther away, but neutrino-driven, we are thinking about galactic objects, and these galactic events are relatively rare. So one every 30 years or so. So it's about 2 or 3 per century in our galaxy. Okay, so this is the expected observation rate for this event. So how are the gravitational waves produced in this case? So from the formation of the proton-neutron star to the explosion or black hole formation or whatever, this phase that you have in between is characterized by a series of instabilities. So you have, for example, convection inside the proton-neutron star, and outside the proton-neutron star, this region is very hot and is convectively unstable. You also have instabilities related to the shock location. So the shock location doesn't stay spherical, but it starts deforming a lot by the so-called standing accretion shock instability, or SASI, which produces all the deformation. So all these instabilities, what are doing is inducing perturbations onto the proton-neutron star, which is the most compact part of the collapsing star. Okay, and this proton-neutron star, which is the compact part, which is being perturbed, is the one which is going to emit gravitational waves. So we are going to observe the result of all these instabilities and all these perturbations acting onto the proton-neutron star. Right. So which kind of signals can you get from this excitation of the proton-neutron star? So the first signal will be the bounce signal, which happens at the time of bounce. Is the result of the rapid change of the quadrupolar momentum of the core as it bounces. But since it's a change of the quadrupolar momentum, only happens in cases where the collapsing core has a quadrupolar momentum, so it has a deformation, and this only happens if the collapsing core was rotating initially, so it was deformed. So the bounce signal is very characteristic of fast rotating progenitors, but it won't appear in the case of neutrino-driven explosions, so the ones in which there is no rotation present. So this typical peak here is characteristics just in the cases in which you have fast rotation and won't appear in other cases. So now from time 0, let's call it the time of bounce, up to the onset of explosion, which it may, I mean, this period is about, it may be very fast, a few 100 milliseconds, typically can span up to about 1 second, something like that. So during this time, you have all those oscillations that will, excitations of the proton neutron star, which will excite different modes of the proton neutron star. So I will show many more examples later, but this is a typical spectrogram, time versus frequency representation of the gravitational wave. And what you see is these characteristic patterns which rise up and in some cases down. And these are essentially different modes that are being excited in the proton neutron star. And then once you have the onset of the explosion, most of these excitations are stopped, and you have but you still have a very hot proton neutron star, which will cool down in time scale of 10 to 50, well, of minutes, but it will become completely unstable during 10 to 50 seconds. So during this first minute, there is still motions going on inside the proton neutron star, and this will have some gravitational wave signal from this convection. So now, so let's focus in the post-bounce signal. So yeah, so the characteristic frequency changes because during this first second, as I just showed, because the characteristics of the proton neutron star is changing. So you initially at bounce, the proton neutron star is about half solar mass, and during this first second is increasing its mass because it's accreting matter. So it will increase up to between 1.2 and 2 solar masses, and then at the same time, the proton neutron star is cooling down because of the neutrino emission, and is shrinking because of all these effects combined from about 30 kilometers to 10 kilometers. So what you see, the increase in frequency is due to this shrinking, essentially due to the shrinking of the proton neutron star. And as I said, you have all these excitations that are exciting the proton neutron star and is producing this emission of gravitational waves, which is observed and is related to the normal modes of the proton neutron star. So if you look at the signal itself looks very stochastic. So this is, as you see, is 1 second duration, and is very stochastic in nature. But when you perform spectrograms, you start seeing regular patterns, which are you can see in essentially all numerical simulations, and are these typical rising arcs here, which is seen in all simulations. And then you have some signatures at low frequencies, which are typically related to the presence or associated to the presence of shock instabilities. And sometimes you have these patterns going downwards here or here. Okay, so the thing is, what information can we extract from all these modes which are being excited? So to be able to extract information, so the first thing that you have to do is so this rising arc, for example, what is this mode? So can we identify in a unique way what is this mode, just looking at the spectrogram? The second is, so what is the frequency pattern here is telling us about the properties of the proton neutron star. So, and the third one will be how, I mean, if we observe this, are we able to do inference and extraction information about the proton neutron star? So for the first thing, mode identification, this is we have a couple of papers just working on focuses on that. So, but I'm going to summarize. So what we essentially do is we perform numerical simulations, multidimensional numerical simulations. So the output that we have is some multidimensional output in time, so the full numerical simulations. And from that, we can extract the gravitational waveform and perform the spectrograms, okay? So in parallel, what we can do is for each time snapshot, we just make an average, angular average. So we get a one-dimensional radial profile, and we have different radial profile for different times. So we have a sequence of radial profiles, and each radial profile, so inside the shock, everything is approximately in hydrostatic equilibrium. So you can consider that each profile is a hydrostatic equilibrium system. So you can study perturbations, linear perturbations of this system, in particular L equal to linear perturbation, and extract the eigenmodes, so the eigenfrequencies at which this profile will oscillate. And since this is changing slowly in time, what you can compute is for each time, you can compute the instantaneous eigenfrequencies of the system, and therefore compute the evolution of the eigenfrequencies with time. Okay, and now you have a lot of eigenmodes, and you want to compare with the spectrogram that you have, and try to see if some of these or which of these modes match the ones that are observed in the spectrogram. So in general, the eigenvalue structure is complicated. Basically you have two families, big families, which are P modes, which are due to pressure waves essentially, and the G modes, which are due to gravity waves. So the restoring force of G modes is buoyancy. Okay, so the leading or the lowest order mode of the P mode family is called the fundamental mode, or F mode, which will be here. And you see that it has a difficult, a complex structure in which there is no clear separation between G modes and P modes. They are all mixed. But if you look, if you select a few of these modes and plot it on top of the spectrum, you see that some of these modes actually track very well the features that are seen in the spectrum. For example, this feature here is related to this 2G2 mode. This is a G mode. Or this feature going down here is related to this 2G3 mode, which is going down here. Some other modes are not seen at all in the spectrograms, actually most of the modes, especially the high order. So essentially there are some modes which are excited particularly well, and they are emitting efficiently gravitational waves, and these are the ones that are seen. So now when you look at, across different models from different authors, what you see is that systematically is always this G2 mode, which is the one that is excited. Okay, in our notation it's called G2, but in some other authors identify it as an F mode. So there is still some things to settle about the labeling of the mode, but it's always this particular mode that is excited primordially in these cases. So we have identified that this is the mode that is always present. So the second work will be to extract universal relations. So here what we did is just to perform many numerical simulations. These are 26 numerical simulations with different codes, different equation states, different progenitors. And now you take the data all together of all the simulations at all times. So you have the frequencies for these particular modes at all times for 26 simulations, and you put everything together, the frequency of the mode as a function of some properties of the protoneutron star, instantaneous properties. So you will take, for example, for a particular simulation at a given time, what is the frequency and what is this quantity here. This is the mass of the protoneutron star over radius square of the protoneutron star, and then you get a point. And then you do this for all simulation and all the times. So what you can see is that for this G2 mode in particular, there is a nice relation with some scatter, but in principle there is some universal relation that tells you that regardless of the progenitor equation state or the code use, or even the time during the simulation, if you observe at any time a feature this feature, this G2 mode, at a given frequency, then you can put some constraint on the surface gravity, which is this combination of mass and radius of the proton-neutron star. So in principle, this can be used to make inference, and is independent on the equation state. So we obtain similar universal relations for F and P modes. I'm not going to enter very deep on that because I'm not going to show result with these universal relations, but it depends on all the different quantities. But the thing is that once you have this, you can start doing inference. So
Pablo, sorry.
yes.
Are all of these points that are plotted at those, are they all for non-rotating cores?
Yes. Here, everything is done for non-rotating stars. If you have rotation, this is much more complicated because the linear analysis is more complicated, and because the background is not spherical anymore, so the analysis is much more difficult. So here we are relying in that the most common outcome is a neutrino-driven, non-rotating Corcoran supernovae. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah. So now, if you have an observation in which you can have a gravitational wave signal and you can make a spectrogram, so frequency versus time, and now you know a universal relation which relates your frequency with your surface gravity. Now the idea is that you can transform this observation into an inference into the evolution of the surface gravity as a function of time. And this is what actually we did recently in this paper. What you do is you just inject waveforms of some 2D progenitors that I have to tell that these simulations were not used to derive the universal relation. So this is an independent set of the ones used for the universal relation. So we make injections of these waveforms into that was single detector noise, okay, and then at different distances, and then we perform spectrograms, and we have an algorithm which is essentially extracting the frequency versus time, so tracking this main feature and extracting this frequency here. And now once you have f of t, then you can use the universal relation to make the inference. So the inferred value will be the red symbols, and the confidence interval is plotted in black. And then the true value, which you know because you are performing this for a numerical simulation, so you know the true value of this ratio is in black. So you can see that this is quite good agreement between both. Okay, so you can really infer this parameter with some error just using gravitational wave data. Now you can do this at multiple distances for different detectors, and you can have an idea of what is the distance at which you can perform this inference. And you can see that for current detectors, we should be able to do this for a galactic supernova. So if we were to detect a supernova, a galactic supernova, we should be able to perform this analysis and infer the time evolution of the surface gravity of the proton-neutron star. Okay, and if you go to next third generation detectors, you should be able to do it at much larger distances. So now, I'm going to switch a bit. So I said that I was going to focus on neutrino-driven explosions, but I'm going to talk a bit about rapidly rotating progenitors as well, because they are interesting. So I'm going to show what we can do just with the bounce signal, which appears only for fast rotating progenitors. So the characteristics, so that will be a typical signal. So I'm going to consider only the bounce, which is the the first few milliseconds, which have a very particular shape. So you have this positive, negative, positive peak, and then some kind of ring down. And after this bounce signal, you will have, I mean, a signal which resembles the one that I just showed. But I'm just going to focus in this signal, the first few milliseconds. Okay, now that the time scale is milliseconds. So what these papers of Richer et al. Show is that essentially the shape of this peak is quite universal. Okay, if you rescale it appropriately. So if you rescale this with the amplitude of the peak and the frequency of the post-bounce signal, this signal is essentially universal. And you can use this signal, I think I have it, yeah. And the two parameters in which this signal depends, which are the amplitude and the frequency, the peak frequency, are related to properties of the proton-neutron star. In particular, the amplitude is related to some parameter which tracks the rotation. So this is the rotational kinetic energy over potential energy of the system. So this is a measure of the rotation of the proton-neutron star. And for unless you go to fast extreme rotating cases, which probably are unrealistic, if you are in some fast rotating regime, you have a linear relation between these two quantities. So in principle, if you can measure one, you can infer the other. And the same for the peak frequency. So unless you go to extreme rotation, you have a relation between the peak frequency and the square root of the mean density or the central density of the proton-neutron star. So if you are able to measure the peak frequency, you can infer the other. So what we are trying to do is to see if we can infer the amplitude and the peak frequency from injected signals in noise. Okay, so this is what we did. So we injected signals into Gaussian color noise with a 3-detector network, and then we are using Bilby and these templates that I was talking about that, which only depends on two parameters, the amplitude and the peak frequency, and then we try to extract the information. And we show that you can actually do that. You can nicely get these two parameters, the amplitude and the peak frequency, and extract nicely these two parameters. And you can actually reconstruct the signal quite well. So now, how far away can we do that? So in principle, if you want to do inference with about 10% errors or less, this is possible within 10 to 50 kiloparsecs. Okay, but this is only true for fast rotating progenitors. So if we have a fast rotating progenitor in a galactic supernova, we should be able to measure the peak frequency and the amplitude of the waveform, and from that we can put constraints on the square root of the mean density and we may be able to put constraints on the rotation. The rotation is more difficult because the amplitude of the waveform is degenerated with distance, but also with the inclination angle of the source. So you have some degeneration between the value of the rotation, so how fast it's rotating, and how large is the inclination. So there are some things that we still have to work out. So what else? So now going back to the case of non-rotating stars, I told you that if you go to longer time, so in the time scales after the explosion, time scale of 10 to 50 seconds, you have a convection in the proton-neutron star, and this will emit gravitational waves. So what we have done very recently is just perform very long-term simulations of the proton-neutron star. So long-term simulations, we are talking about timescales of many seconds, are difficult in general, especially if you are doing the simulations in 3D. So what we do is do this MHD simulation, so this includes magnetic fields, in 3D using the anelastic approximation. The problem with the anelastic approximation, the nice thing that this has is that it's computational is very efficient, so you can do very long time simulations, but it has the problem that you have in the anelastic approximation, the background is fixed. So what we do is just we took 2 snapshots of the post-bounce evolutions at 0.2 seconds and 5 seconds, and we make evolutions, long-term evolutions of these backgrounds. So what you get at the end is, what you do is to characterize what is the convection and what is the gravitational wave emission due to convection at 2 particular times. And then you can have an idea of how the gravitational wave due to convection is evolving just by having these 2 snapshots. Okay, so it has some limitations. So here in this plot here, what we have is the RMS value of the strain amplitude of the waveform. So it's a measure of the mean value of the gravitational wave strain at these 2 snapshots, depending on the angular frequency. So how fast it's rotating. So if you go to low rotation rates, then essentially the rotation is not playing any role. So that will correspond to the case of neutrino-driven explosions, for example. And you can see that the typical amplitude of the waveform is about 10 to the minus 24, which is below the values that we were showing for proton-neutron star oscillations. So this is a subdominant effect. And if you go to 5 seconds, you see that there is a dramatic decrease in the amplitude to 10 to the minus 27. So it's going to be difficult to follow this signal to be in very long time scales. Now, if you go to fast rotating progenitors, you see that at some point there is an effect of the rotation, and the strain actually scales with the rotational frequency and it increases. So it's still subdominant, but it reaches much larger strains, so that may be detectable for galactic supernovae. And even at 5 seconds, if you have sufficiently fast rotation, you have strains which may be observable. Okay. Yeah, let's go to the next one. So how does the spectrum look? So if you go to the slow rotation regime, the spectrum typically is a broadband spectrum. So it doesn't have any particular feature. So it's just broadband with some characteristic frequency. So the peak frequency of the spectrum is related to the overturn frequency of the convection going on. So the fastest the convection is rotating, so to say. So the largest the frequency of the overturn frequency of the convection is, the larger the typical frequencies. Yeah, but if you go to the fast rotating regime, then what you start seeing is the appearance of inertial modes, which look like these peaks here. So in principle, these inertial modes scale with the rotational frequency. So in principle, if you are able to measure these peaks, you have some information about the rotational frequency, but also the spacing between the modes is telling you something about the extent and the shape of the convective layer. So it's telling you something about how large is the layer in which you have convection. So we still don't have relations which tell you exactly, I mean, if you see this kind of patterns of frequency, what can you infer? But in principle, it should be possible to do some kind of astereosismology in which you measure these peaks and you can tell something about rotation and the shape of the convection layer, which is quite interesting.
Pablo?
Yeah.
Okay, so can I just ask you a little bit about this overturn frequency is it something that's constant or is it changing over time?
Yes, this is changing over time. I don't have a plot here, but it's essentially going towards lower frequencies. So essentially, as the proton neutron star is cooling down, you are removing the entropy gradients which are producing the convection, and this makes the overturn frequencies just reducing over time. So I think, yeah, I should have plotted something with we have that in the paper. So if I remember well, it can start as high as 1 kilohertz, and then I think at 5 seconds it could go down to 100 hertz or something like that. So this is the range. The typical range is between 100 hertz and 1 kilohertz, in which you can have this convection.
Okay,
features.
And then if you're doing a simulation, you extract that turn frequency. Well, I guess you have to calculate it from what is happening in the simulation over time.
Yes, we have this in the simulations. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yes. Here, yeah, in this particular plot, I'm just showing that it scales with this frequency. But yeah, we know. I think we even have plots of the over. Well, I'm not sure if we have this plot. Yeah, but we have all this information in the paper.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, and with this, I think yeah, I will end the presentation. So the conclusion or the message that I want to tell you is that that we have multiple possibilities in gravitational wave signals from Corkola supernovas to infer properties of the proton neutron star. The most promising one is through G modes, and maybe also through P modes or these SASI modes, which I didn't mention, but there is also some features that in the future we may be able to extract some information, but it's possible to do astereosismology with proton neutron star. We have shown it with G modes, but there are other possibilities. For the case of fast rotation, there is information that can be extracted from the bounds, and potentially it may be possible also in the if we are able to observe inertial modes in the long-term evolution. Just the observation of any of these features will be a confirmation of the core collapse supernova model. But we can also infer some properties of the proton neutron star, and one of the open questions is, well, if you are able to measure, for example, I don't know, the surface gravity of the proton neutron star, what can you tell about, for example, the quasar state or the progenitor star, these kind of things. And this is a much more complicated problem that involves trying to relate, numerical simulations with the properties of the proton neutron star, and also the properties of the quasar state from the nuclear physics point of view, how it affects the, for example, surface gravity of the proton neutron star. So what constraint can be extracted, and there is much more work that needs to be done in all these cases, just to have to have more physical inference about the problem, and not just the surface gravity, for example. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's give Pablo a round of applause. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.